Few things bring me greater joy than watching a puppy in full flight. Whenever I see an unrestricted puppy in a public place, I'll scan my environment looking for other spectators. I'll focus on anyone who looks upset and I'll try to read their minds. Here's what I'll typically come up with. Some people are so irresponsible. What kind of idiot lets their puppy run like that when their growth plates are still open? The moment this puppy's owner receives a lecture on responsible parenting from the angry self-appointed expert is the moment I step in. At this stage, I'll need my knowledge of canine skeletal development to outgun their knowledge of canine skeletal development. So what do I know? Well, this is a list of the papers, case reports and book chapters that I've authored or co-authored. Every one involved detailed analysis of the published literature relevant to that subject, typically 25 to 50 references for a paper and 100 to 150 for a book chapter. We'll design, redesign, then redesign again, often with the help of a specialist statistician. But the real fun starts when the reviewers get involved. They'll ask dozens of challenging questions, they'll request additional data, and at least one of the three can suggest an entire rewrite. But there's a silver lining to this laborious process. When the torture's over, I know the subject inside out. So when I challenge someone on the subject of canine skeletal development, I'm quietly confident that I'll know more than them. My inaugural first author paper was on hip dysplasia. This paper's reference list contains 30 studies relevant to hip joint development. To have any chance of emerging unscathed from my hypothetical defense in the park, I must translate the complex science contained in these papers into plain language. So let's start at the beginning. What is hip dysplasia? It's inherited, but it's not congenital. In other words, affected puppies are born with normal hips, but they possess genes which code for abnormal development. The first detectable abnormality is weak collagen in the joint capsule. This causes joint laxity, which is detectable from 2 months and varies from mild to severe. The term hip dysplasia refers to the processes involved in faulty development. Secondary osteoarthritis refers to the consequences of that faulty development. Building construction makes a good analogy. DNA is like an architect. She draws up a plan and a team of builders execute the plan. If the builders create a poor quality structure based on a bad plan, their faulty construction is our analogy of hip dysplasia. The inevitable drafts, leaks and water damage are not an analogy of hip dysplasia. They're an analogy of the consequences of hip dysplasia, which is why we call them secondary changes. We know what causes hip dysplasia: bad genes. And we know how to deal with bad genes: selective breeding, otherwise known as artificial selection. Just as farmers make fragile plants hardier by crossing them with robust plants, we can make fragile dogs hardier by crossing them with genetically robust dogs. University of Florida researchers showed us just how quickly we could eliminate a common inherited condition using selective breeding. They crossed Labradors with hip dysplasia and normal greyhounds to produce a colony of hybrid greyadors. They showed that the higher the percentage of the genetically privileged greyhound, the lower the risk of hip dysplasia. Around half of first-generation greyadors developed hip dysplasia, but crossing first-generation greyadors with greyhounds reduced the incidence to 1 in 38. To put it simply, in a world without human interference, developmental joint disease would rapidly become a thing of the past. This is an unpalatable truth, and the public are unlikely to embrace the concept of canine-free love. A more socially acceptable target than ridding the world of high-risk breeds is identifying ways to limit the expression of their harmful genes. To understand how to limit the expression of harmful genes, we must first understand heritability, which is a statistic used to describe the relationship between genetic risk and physical development. Genetically hardwired features like height and skeletal conformation have high heritability values. For human context, height has a heritability of 79%, which means genetic variation accounts for 79% of height variation within a population. For example, genetics explains why Dutch people are on average 25 centimeters taller than the diminutive population of Timor. But heritability is not a measure of individual risk. If we send a child from Timor to live in Holland, there is not a 21% probability that they'll grow taller. Let's look at a vivid veterinary example of genetic risk. On the left we have a whippet, on the right a bulldog. An estimated 10 to 15 gene loci instruct the whippet to develop a long, thin skull. No matter how we manipulate her environment, nothing will make this whippet develop brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome. It's essentially impossible. Those same 10 to 15 gene loci instruct the bulldog to develop a short, wide skull, narrow nostrils, etc., etc. We could alter this bulldog's environment to make it easier for her to breathe. For instance, we could raise her in an oxygen tent. But if she breathes more easily, it does not mean we've changed her phenotype. Genes which code for conformation don't respond to mechanical cues. So when researchers put a bulldog on a treadmill and they struggle to breathe, those researchers aren't causing BOAS. They're using exercise to detect BOAS. Now, we're not asking if dysplastic dogs are less exercise tolerant than normal dogs. We're asking if certain types of exercise increase the risk of abnormal joint development. Our literature review begins with what I believe is the most important study published in my discipline. The amount of work involved was monumental. Penn State University researchers recruited a group of 48 Labrador retrievers from family lines with a high incidence of hip dysplasia. Starting at 8 weeks, 24 puppies were fed enough to become overweight but not obese. A second lean-fed group matched by gender and body weight consumed 25% less than their paired littermates. This group maintained an ideal body weight throughout life. The difference between the two groups was dramatic. Lean dogs had a 5-fold lower risk of hip dysplasia, and their overall risk of arthritis in multiple joints was significantly reduced. The lean dogs developed less severe chronic pain, which occurred relatively later in life. But this isn't purely a study of health span. It's also a study of lifespan. As a result of calorie restriction alone, lean dogs enjoyed an average lifespan which was 1.8 years longer than their overweight littermates. Back to our galloping puppy. Here's a popular narrative. This sweet little puppy is very fragile and we must protect her from harm. Therefore, unrestricted exercise causes developmental joint disease. Okay. This man has whiskers, therefore this man must be a cat. I'm here talking to you because I'm trying to protect puppies from fallacies like this. The ever-popular Protect Your Puppy social media post. This one has a mind-boggling 2,500 shares. The problem with these posts is that harmful misinformation is sugar-coated with a thin layer of sensible advice. Never ever go toe-to-toe with the author of one of these posts because you will quickly find yourself knee-deep in myths, misinformation and half-truths. This is what the actual truth looks like. This post contains only healthy, proven facts and no unhealthy, unproven fallacies. What's the origin of the exercise restriction myth? The short answer is nobody knows, but there is a plausible theory. In the 1970s, veterinary researchers were far ahead of human healthcare researchers in the field of skeletal development. So in 1975, the National Institutes of Health invited a veterinary surgeon called Wayne Reiser to study the effects of exercise restriction on puppies. He proved that crate-confined German Shepherd dog puppies were less likely than unrestricted puppies to develop hip dysplasia. Dr. Reiser attributed the protective effect of restriction to the use of excessively small cages. His unfortunate puppies grew taller than their crates, forcing them to stand with a wide base stance. The Ortolani test demonstrates the advantages conferred by a wide base stance. Specifically, it improves hip congruity by rotating the femoral head into the acetabulum. The NIH used their study to support the practice of fitting Pavlik harnesses to produce a hip abducted posture in dysplastic children. Dr. Reiser was a veterinary orthopedic pioneer. I bet he'd be shocked if he knew his work would form the basis for an unhealthy veterinary myth. His actual conclusion, that hip abduction limits dysplasia, evolved into the fallacy that exercise restriction prevents hip dysplasia. Fast forward to 1988 when a Finnish research team retested the exercise restriction hypothesis in dramatic fashion. In 2 studies, beagle puppies ran for 5 days a week on a 15-degree incline treadmill. In their first study, they ran 4 kilometers a day for 15 weeks. This protocol produced subtle improvement in cartilage quality compared with control puppies. In the second study, puppies ran up to 40 kilometers a day, literally a marathon distance, every day for a year. How did their developing joints handle the strain of a daily marathon? Did their cartilage endure, or did it crumble? When researchers microscopically analysed articular cartilage, synovium, and synovial fluid, all 3 appeared grossly normal. The only difference between the test group and control group was focal superficial cartilage matrix change. This lack of degeneration is unsurprising. Many human studies prove long-distance runners have a lower osteoarthritis risk than couch potatoes. Chihuahua means different things to different people. For animal lovers, it's the name of a small dog breed. For ultra-runners, Chihuahua is home to the Raramuri, a name which translates to fast runners. Traditionally, the Raramuri ran marathon distances to deliver messages, transport goods or hunt, all while indulging in their favourite pastime. Their idea of a fun weekend involves a multi-day ultramarathon relay race. The Raramuri running culture gained worldwide attention, prompting one research team to investigate if ultra-running increased their susceptibility to joint problems compared to similar indigenous communities. It didn't. Joint disease prevalence among the Raramuri was 10.5%, nearly 3-fold lower than in Australian Aboriginal populations whose children and adolescents have no such tradition of ultra-running. The dog equivalent of the Raramuri is the grey wolf. This thesis, written by David Meck, who's a world-famous wolf expert, offers a fascinating insight into normal wolf cub behaviour. Grey wolves are migratory. In winter, adults usually bring the whole family on hunts. Some of the longest recorded wolf migrations involve cubs. For instance, one radio-collared pack, including an 8-week-old cub, travelled up to 32 kilometers per day. Despite myriad documented feats of wolf cub endurance, the vast veterinary database contains only a single case report of non-clinical hip dysplasia in an adult timber wolf. If exercise was the trigger, wolves wouldn't have survived for 750,000 years, and domestic dogs wouldn't exist. This fact is both indisputable and difficult to ignore. But evolutionary science isn't everyone's cup of tea. Cynics can scoff while they highlight the obvious morphological differences between wolves and chihuahuas. But even a hardened cynic would struggle to explain the guide dog paradox. While wolves teach us that running doesn't harm developing joints, guide dogs teach us that limiting exercise doesn't help. According to popular opinion, guide dog puppies receive ideal exercise. In theory, a puppyhood of low-impact leash walk should protect their vulnerable joints. But the theory isn't supported by science. The commonest reason for guide dog health withdrawal is musculoskeletal disorders. In 2016, it accounted for 1 in 3 retirements. Historical guide dog hip dysplasia and elbow dysplasia prevalence is 20 to 30%. Cruciate ligament injuries are also common. Guide dog charity's success in reducing joint disease prevalence owes everything to careful breeding and nothing to limited exercise. Not many people know this, but over the course of a decade, actor Nicolas Cage killed more than 1,000 people. Specifically, every time Nicolas Cage appears in a movie, people drown in swimming pools. In 2007, Nicolas Cage appeared in no less than 4 movies, including one called Ghost Rider. This movie wasn't just bad, it was lethally abysmal, causing a staggering 122 deaths by drowning. Now, I'm joking, of course. I don't have to tell an educated audience that correlation doesn't imply causation. But unfortunately, when I'm defending exercise, some sections of the public need reminding. Let's take a skeptical look at some correlations which have been misinterpreted as causal relationships. This study, which included 325 Swedish Labradors identified running after balls and sticks as risk factors for hip and elbow dysplasia. So we have a choice. We can either accept this fact at face value, or we can ask the obvious question: how do they know? The short answer is they don't. What we do know based on robust evidence is that overfeeding puppies dramatically increases their risk of developmental joint disease. But we have no way of knowing if affected dogs in this study were overfed as puppies, because the survey asked questions about how adult Labradors, I quote, perform and lead their lives, not how they performed and led their lives before developing joint disease. Why did this survey include only adult dogs? It's because the Swedish Kennel Club wait until at least 12 months before screening dogs for hip and elbow dysplasia. Why? Because these conditions develop before 12 months. A dog's adult lifestyle is irrelevant. In effect, we have precisely no evidence that chasing sticks and balls causes abnormal joint development, just as we have precisely no evidence that Nick Cage causes people to drown in swimming pools. Do slippery surfaces cause hip dysplasia? We must always start with why, so why would slippery surfaces cause hip dysplasia? Ice skaters have incredible core strength, Arctic grey wolves run marathons on permafrost, and cage-restricted puppies who have a hip-abducted posture have a reduced risk of hip dysplasia. Put simply, this hypothesis isn't plausible, yet here it is in black and white. Dogs that were kept on a floor covered with a slippery material were 1.6 times as likely to develop hip dysplasia. The floor cover was defined as non-slippery when covered with carpet, rubber, blankets, sawdust or straw. OK? The p-value for the comparison of floor surface and a diagnosis of hip dysplasia was 0.08. But the cutoff for statistical significance is less than 0.05. So the relationship between floor surface and a diagnosis of hip dysplasia was not statistically significant. And this study also concluded that dogs that were over 5 years old were 1.8 times as likely to develop hip dysplasia. So middle-aged dogs are nearly twice as likely to develop a condition which develops between 2 and 10 months of age. I think not. Adult boxers with hind limb lameness have cruciate disease until proven otherwise, but this doesn't mean that veterinary surgeons won't x-ray a 5-year-old boxer's hips. This is not a study comparing lame boxers with hip dysplasia to normal boxers. It's a study comparing lame boxers with an incidental finding of hip dysplasia to boxers who haven't had hip x-rays. Without hip x-rays, how do we know they don't have hip dysplasia? The answer is we don't. This study is probably the highest profile victim of the Nicolas Cage effect. There's a correlation between puppies with access to stairs and hip dysplasia, so now some people believe stair exercise causes hip dysplasia. But why on earth would an exercise which increases core strength cause an inherited conformational defect? The secondary findings are cited less often, namely that off-leash exercise and being born in the spring or summer or on a farm seem to be protective. How do we explain the so-called zodiac effect? Well, here's one hypothesis. The protective effect of being born in autumn suggests that a decreased level of exercise during subsequent development over winter may positively impact on final hip joint conformation. Aha! Exercise, you have finally been caught out. Or have you? Multiple studies show that both adults and children tend to gain weight in the winter and lose it in the summer. For example, this study showed an average of 1.21% increase in body weight, that's 1 kilogram between autumn and winter. And another study found that people gained an average of 1.3 kilograms between November and March, then lost it again in spring and summer. And we know there's a strong link between pet owner body mass index and dog body condition score. Which brings us back to this study, which taught us that small changes in body composition make a big impact on health. This is not an observational study like most of the others which looked back in time at pre-existing data. This study has an experimental design. All the important variables affecting joint disease were carefully controlled so the researchers could study the variable of interest, overfeeding. Just to remind you, this study showed that lean dogs had a 5-fold lower risk of hip dysplasia, and they lived an average of 1.8 years longer than overweight dogs. Exercise restriction cannot achieve any of these outcomes, but for some reason throwing mud at exercise and claiming that it sticks remains a popular pastime even for some veterinary professionals. Given the complete lack of evidence of any causal relationship between running, stairs, slippery surfaces and developmental joint disease, how can we explain the popularity of these myths? From my perspective, there's a simple explanation. Humans crave control, which explains why life hacks are so popular. If you want to win a popularity contest, tell people there's a simple trick to protect their dog from an inherited joint disease. It's easy to embrace the idea that avoiding stairs and slippery surfaces, i.e. life hacks, can help. What about 5 minutes of exercise per month of age? Well, the appeal of this fallacy is that it sounds authentic, as if it's based on science. But in reality, someone just made it up. Sadly, to paraphrase Jonathan Swift, falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after. If a mountain of high-quality evidence supporting the health benefits of exercise is not sufficiently convincing, I recommend focusing on the serious harms of restriction. Picture a paediatrician diagnosing a child with hip dysplasia. The child's parents are referred to a physiotherapist who explains the problem. Your daughter's hips have weak primary stabilizers. Her hip joint capsule isn't tight enough, so her secondary stabilizers must work harder. She explains that the overworked hip stabilizers form part of her core. Everything's making perfect sense until the physiotherapist suggests a program to weaken her core. Here it is. Restrict exercise to 10 minutes of slow crawling 3 times a day. Feed the recommended amount for a normal child, even though she isn't allowed to exercise. Okay, so she might pack on some extra puppy fat, but what harm can that do? And finally, stop her playing with other children because too much play is bad for the hips. This is, of course, not true. Play does not harm developing joints. It's how young mammals learn how to deal with the unexpected. When they run, jump and chase one another, they alternate between losing and regaining control both physically and emotionally. They're microdosing on fear, as if deliberately learning how to deal with the physical and emotional challenges of life. But supporters of restricted exercise programs are typically unmoved by this reality. Here's their commonest defense. Restricted exercise programs are a guideline created to discourage irresponsible exercise. At first glance, this argument seems moderate and sensible. At second glance, it's anything but. It's a perfect example of a slippery slope fallacy. How would it sound if we applied the same logic to diet? Imagine someone suggested feeding your dog 1 carrot per day per month of age. When you counter that a 100% carrot diet is unbalanced, they'd say, it's only a guideline to stop you feeding grapes and chocolate. Dogs, like children, are born to run and play, but they're not designed to tolerate unnatural exercise. For a human example, Little League baseball players have a higher incidence of elbow OCD, and child gymnasts have a higher risk of wrist arthritis. The best veterinary example of unnatural exercise comes from sporting dogs, and one of the best resources on responsible sporting dog exercise comes from agility dog trainers. If you'd like to learn from someone you can trust, I highly recommend this short video from Nara Cuddy, who offers very sensible advice on sporting puppy exercise. I'm going to close with the most important point of all. We cannot and must not view exercise and physical health in a vacuum. We must also consider mental health. Professor Peter Gray, a leading light on child psychology, argues that unstructured play is crucial for learning in all mammals. For example, unstructured play allows young animals to solve problems, exert self-control, follow rules, regulate their emotions, and experience joy. But unstructured play is on the decline. I quote, "Over the past half-century in the United States and other developed nations, children's free play with other children has declined sharply. Over the same period, anxiety, depression, suicide, feelings of helplessness and narcissism have increased sharply in children, adolescents and young adults." Of course, correlation does not imply causation, but in this case there is published evidence supporting a causal relationship. Prospective studies assessing the impact of restricted play show that immature mammals deprived of the opportunity to play are significantly more likely to display emotional extremes in stressful situations. They struggle to adapt, are more fearful, and they're prone to misplaced aggression, and this matters. Recent studies from the UK and Australia found the commonest cause of death in dogs under 3 years old is euthanasia due to behavioural problems. Ultimately, letting puppies run and play isn't just protecting their joints, it's saving their lives. For me, there's a very simple conclusion. If puppies want to run and play, let them run and play. If they want to socialise, let them socialise. And if they want to rest, let them rest.